the Beatles, and a lot more with Anthony from Rushtrader next on Retro Serial. Hey everyone, I'm Ian C. You're watching or listening to Retro Serial. On today's podcast, we have Anthony from Rushtrader. He has a great channel. I'm going to go ahead and leave a link to his YouTube channel in the description box below, so go ahead and check it out. He talks about a lot of bands that I'm interested, and I'm sure by extension that people who listen to this podcast are interested in. What we talk about today mostly is the Beatles, and we talk about it from kind of a philosophical standpoint, a historical standpoint, and an influential standpoint, and how it influenced Generation X. But let me just warn you up front, it takes a while to get to the Beatles, so I don't know how to timestamp yet, but you might want to rush ahead till you get to that point, or you can listen to us talk about other things like hair metal and grunge and just kind of our favorite bands and influences and stuff like that. It was just kind of a sit down, get to know the guy, and then going on to talking about the Beatles. And I'm going to keep this introduction short because there's already a lot before we get there. But let me just go ahead and remind you to go ahead, if you're listening to this on a podcast form, please give me a review and a rating. And if you would not mind, if you want to go over to the YouTube page as well, hit the subscribe button, hit the thumbs up button, hit the button, whatever it is over there. And whether you're on YouTube or whether you are listening to this on podcast, please share it on your favorite social media. If you want to support the podcast, you are more than welcome to. Please go ahead and go over to our Patreon page. The link will be in the description below, and you can be part of our Cornflake Club, which is just $3 a month. Just a tip saying thank you, we like what you're doing, and keep it up. Or you can be part of the Honeycomb Hideout, where it's $5 a month, and you will receive most all videos and podcasts one day before everybody else does. So if you want to be part of the Insiders Club, please go ahead and join that. And with all that said, we're just going to get straight to the interview. All right, everyone. Well, I don't need to do any more introduction. I've got the man right here. This is Anthony from Rushtrader. He's got a Rushtrader web page, and he's got a YouTube page as well. And I had been in the past binge watching your program because I found it so fascinating. And, you and I think a lot alike on a lot of bands, especially bands of the Generation X, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And today we're going to be talking about something a little bit different. We'll get there real soon. We're going to talk about the Beatles. And you are definitely going to be the expert, because although I love the Beatles, I'm not like a huge know-it-all when it comes to the Beatles. So we're going to get to that, and I'm going to ask you some tough questions too about the Beatles. But let's start with the man himself and your YouTube page. What caused you to do the rushtrader.com and the Rushtrader YouTube page? What was that? What was the beginning of that in your mind?
Okay, well, I can definitely get into that. First, I just want to say thank you, Ian, for having me here. And the whole Rushtrader thing goes back to, I would say, the 90s. Rush is my favorite band. I don't know how familiar you are with them, but they were my favorite band back in 85 or 6, and still are now. And back in the day, I came across bootlegs of Rush, and it kind of blew my mind to hear them playing in a setting that I had never heard, because I was always hearing the official albums that came out, and that's all that you got. But I was starting to hear Rush from 74, 75, when Geddy was screaming his lungs out. Very different era that never got captured officially, I don't think, right. But I started hearing bootlegs of concerts that I had never heard before. And when I got to 92, I was hearing stuff from the Roll the Bones tour, which was never captured on a live album. And so these bootlegs, I just kind of said, you know what, I've got to find every single Rush bootleg there is. I have to do that. So I wound up starting up a collection. A friend of mine went over to Europe, and he comes back with these CD bootlegs that he bought in these German record shops and everything, totally blowing my mind because I didn't see any of that here. The advent of the compact disc made it easy for these old shows that had been circulating on cassette or, you know, whatever. Now they were on CD.
Mm-hmm.
And so I set up a website, rushtrader.com. This happened around 2000. To kind of catalog what I had, so I could share it with others, so I could get some more shows. And so I set up the rushtrader.com site, and you know, I eventually got every single Rush bootleg that I could possibly care for.
Wow.
And so then I had people coming to me who had these big, huge bootlegs, like these big, huge lists. They didn't have much in the way of Rush. So I would cherry pick the best of their stuff and they would get my Rush. And before you knew it, my bootleg collection was like a snowball. It just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And my website shows all of the titles that I've got. Well, not even all of them. It's just some of them. I would put them up there just to show people what I had, but also I had to keep track of what I had. So I used it too, to see what I even had. It just got ridiculous to the point where I even stopped putting stuff on my website. So that kept on going until, I don't know, there kind of came a point where I just got tired of collecting boots. I was getting older and it just wasn't my thing. And when YouTube came out, that kind of killed a lot of the trading that was going on, because we used to send each other boots in the mail, you know, send me your list.
Yeah,
and I send those in the mail. And that, it seems kind of like an archaic way of doing it now. You just go to YouTube and look for your favorite show and you'll probably find something, you know.
You'll find something to listen to that's not on one of the official albums that you can kind of dig and groove with and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, you can find anything there. And so eventually I kind of reached a point after the whole bootleg stuff was over with. I don't know, around 2017, I just got this bug. Like, I want to have an outlet to talk about all of these great bands that I've loved and all of these music. And there would be things happening in the news, like when they threw Buckingham out of Fleetwood Mac. I was just like, I can't believe they did that. I want to talk about that. I want to say something, but I don't have an outlet. So I used to be in radio. So I used to have, you know, a show, and I used to have a way to talk about things and play some songs. And I kind of realized, well, I'm probably never going to get back into that. I don't really want to go back into that, but I could start up a channel and talk about this. Plus I had already set up a Rushtrader channel. But what I was doing with it was I was taking all these performances that I would see, because eventually the bootlegs moved from CDs to DVDs. When that came out, we started to get the visuals. We started to get all of these bootlegs of shows, you know, like the in-house feeds of concerts and stuff like that. Now you were getting them on DVD that were getting traded around. So I would see these performances and go like, wow, I can't believe I'm seeing this. Such a great show. I would take it and upload it to my channel. So
really the expansion though happened on the YouTube channel. The website is still really more Rush, right? Because I know that on your YouTube channel, you talk about a lot more than just Rush. Yeah, quite a bit more.
Yeah. The Rushtrader website was basically all of my boots, Rush and all these other bands. The YouTube channel was basically me showing a bunch of clips of bands that, you know, I had seen their performances and wanted to share it. And then I decided at some point, I want to start talking about this stuff. I don't want to upload. So I said, I'm just going to start uploading videos. I'm just going to start to talk about the things that I want to. And I don't know the
now
people that had.
You mentioned that you didn't want to go back to radio.
Yeah.
Why is that? Is this YouTube just kind of more freeing? You have more liberty to say what you really want to say about a band?
Yeah, well, radio had just become so corporate and so clinical. And the fun had been taken out of it. You know, when I first got into it, when I got into radio right before the digital part came into it, where basically you could program your station to run overnight without anybody being there. You know, like when I was there, you had to have somebody there or your station wasn't on, you know?
Yeah.
And you could play what you wanted. You could bring your own stuff in, or, you had a lot more freedom to play what you wanted. And then there came a point where they started to test songs. They would get like an auditorium of people, and they would play them bits of songs to see what songs were popular, and that would decide what songs they were going to play. And it was just very, very clinical, and things started to change, and radio just became boring. And so I just decided, you know what, I'm going to get out of it. Plus, there wasn't a lot of money in it. A lot of people that I saw in radio were always, just kind of going from town to town, because they would go at one station, they would burn out, and they would have to pick up and move their families and go to another city. And I didn't want to live that kind of life. So I just decided I'm getting out of radio, and which was a shame, because that's what I went to college for. It was for radio, but I kind of got disillusioned with it after a few years and went on to other things. But
I think everything's going to mostly, especially now that people are going to actually have internet in their car, not just hook it to their phone. You're going to see a lot more. You're going to see radio die even more than it's already kind of dying. Although I have friends who are in radio, and I interned at a radio station a long, long time ago. It was a talk radio station, but I saw the ins and outs of that, and it was right at the advent where things were kind of going over to running it by computer. So then you'd push the button rather than play the tape, and they actually did have not tapes, but sometimes they were tapes that they actually had to play of somebody talking, you know what I mean? So they'd have, and then they'd have local people come in and talk. Was it a rock station that you were at?
I did work at a rock station. Yeah. I worked at a rock station, and
for me, it was talk radio. So it was really difficult. It was not even the same, but I do know like the behind the scenes, and actually everybody there was saying the same thing you're saying. They're saying it's going corporate. Like, this is not the same as it was when I was, when it was in our heyday. So that's super interesting.
Plus, I will say I was there at the time when we had to actually splice tape. Like, we had tape, and if you wanted to edit something, you had to chop it up with a razor. Whereas just a few years later, digital came in and made it so much easier. It's just, my life would have been so much easier if I had all of those toys. But it just got boring.
Yeah. Well, I like YouTube too, because you can kind of say what you want about a band, if you don't like it or whatever. And I generally try to stay pretty positive. There are some bands that I very much don't like. But if you're on a radio show and the next band is somebody you just don't have a lot of musical respect for, you kind of either have to keep your mouth shut or say something falsely positive about. I could imagine anyway. I don't know. I guess you could say something like, I hate this band and they're going to play it next anyway, and they're coming in this Saturday to do a morning show. I'm not going to be here or whatever. So I can just imagine the more freeing power of YouTube. So is your favorite genre of music? Would you say your favorite genre of music is metal? Would you say that, or would you say it goes beyond metal? Or
no? I do like some metal, but that's not my top thing. I don't know what you'd call it. I'm
like prog rock, or like
I do like prog rock. I do like hard rock. Maybe somewhere in the hard rock scene, I like a lot of bands that tend to be aggressive and have an edge to them, but I also like prog rock, 20-minute songs, 30-minute songs that you could go to sleep to, it just, I know
that, well, you said Rush, and I know Rush is considered probably one of the founder, along with Genesis, one of the founding bands of what's considered to be prog rock, them in Dream Theater and some other underground bands.
I think Rush, though, were I think they were always rooted in hard rock. They may have been seen as a metal band early on. I know that they informed a lot of metal that came after with 2112 and all of that. That was pretty groundbreaking for its time. But I think with a band like Rush, they often drifted in and out of different things. They were kind of like a sponge. They kind of picked up what was going on. They went through a prog rock phase. They didn't start off like that. They started off as kind of like a Zeppelin-ish kind of band. And then when Neil Peart came, he really changed it. They had more of their own sound. And they did kind of go into a prog rock, but eventually by the time we get into the 80s, they're not a prog rock band. I mean, they were a dynamic band, but their songs were shorter and more keyboard driven, and there wasn't a lot of prog rock. I remember that because a lot of the fans from the 70s were bitching and moaning in the 80s about how they don't sound like they used to. And then in the 90s, they were picking up more of the grunge kind of sounds. They had a real more aggressive, a harder sound. So they just kind of always adapted to what was going on in their own way,
I see.
Well,
before we get into the subject matter today, I do want to ask you about at least one of your videos that has been very popular, and that is the advent of grunge rock. And you're talking about the death of metal. One of my very first videos that I did on this channel was the death of hair metal, the rise and fall of hair metal. I was very much, so, just a lot of my fans know this, but just so you know personally too, in the 80s, I was very much into hair metal. I mean, very much. I had my hair dyed blonde. I wanted to be Vince Neil. I was all about that, and some harder rock too, but I was all into Motley Crue and Rat and Dokken, and the other bands that I liked were like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest. But all things that if you opened a copy of, like, say, Metal Edge, you would find these bands, featured prominently. And then for me, I always felt like a phony. I kind of felt, I mean, it's somebody I wanted to be, but I didn't feel like it was a reality for me personally. I felt like I wanted to be that, what a rock star is, for a metal guy, a rock star is like he's the ruler of 9 planets. He gets all the girls. He's the, and I felt like a phony. And so I kind of, when the grunge scene hit, I flipped over to that very quickly, and to a degree very sincerely, because I just identified with it more. I identified with the more internal lyrics rather than lyrics being about excess. I identified with more of the internal struggle with, being a geek or not fitting in or something like that. Cause I always felt more like a phony when I was in my metal phase. But all that is to say, how did you feel about, you were there when the grunge scene took over and these bands all kind of died out? It's a common question I ask. How did you feel about the alternative rock? I like to call it the alternative rock scene. Grunge was like a favored child of the alternative rock scene, but it was larger than grunge. It was larger than grunge. It was that whole underground, punk was here. It kind of went underground, spawned a bunch of bands like the Pixies, and then finally Nirvana came and opened up all kinds of music. How did you look at that?
Well, first of all, at that particular time, I was in radio. I wasn't at the rock station yet. I was at more of an adult kind of station. So I was pissed off that I couldn't play any of this new stuff because it was completely out of the format. So it was like, oh, this great music's coming out and I can't even play it. That was one thing. Now, in terms of how I felt when I first started singing, probably the first inkling that I got that something was changing was Man in a Box by Alice in Chains. When I first saw that video, I was like, man, this is some pretty heavy stuff. And it's nothing like what's been going on. And they kept coming. Like there were bands like that kept on coming. And it was a refreshing change from the Warrant type stuff that I was seeing that I was never into. I would just look at it and go, I can't believe this is even happening, and then the grunge stuff started coming in, and it seemed like this was a whole different approach, and I couldn't see how these two worlds could coexist, and they didn't. I mean, it wasn't long before that they really, really didn't. And there were some bands that I took to, like the Stone Temple Pilots, probably my favorite out of that genre. They had the hard edged, but they also had this Beatlesque kind of a feel to them. Scott Weiland, I thought, was a really great songwriter, and he kind of provided them with a bit of a different side that we didn't get from like a Pearl Jam or a Soundgarden, even though I think that they're great bands. But I started to find things in some of these bands that I really, really liked. I liked just the fact that they were a lot more real. The sound was aggressive, and it just seemed like something that had some substance to it. Although as the the decade went on, I wasn't getting as much out of the music. Like there were no guitar solos, and I didn't pick up on any particular member. Like we started hearing less about guitar players and bass players and drummers, even though there were some, but things got simpler, more chords, and I was missing, you know, some of the stuff from the 80s, not necessarily the hair band stuff, but I don't know. There was just a substance that
I definitely have to say that those bands that came out of the 80s and 70s too, were more about musicianship.
Yeah.
You know, and they did, and I have a video talking about like the differences between grunge and metal. And one of the differences, and I think you're hitting on it there, is the idea that the songs in general, of course, there's with you know, something like metal, there's always going to be an exception to the rule with all the bands and all the songs and all the subgenres. But basically, the songs seem to be an impetus to showcase someone's talent. So there's the song, but the song is there, and then the singer can show you how high he can sing. You can go up all these octaves, and the song is there, and it showcases the guitarist and how cool he is, and how, you know, awesome he can do his licks and stuff like that. Where it seemed the opposite in grunge. It seemed grunge like it was the musicians were there to hold the song up. And so it got simpler, as you said. And that's kind of
or
one
the
of
singer too. The singer was also the one. I mean, when we think about bands like Pearl Jam and Nirvana, and we think about the singers. I mean, we don't really talk a lot about the other guys in Pearl Jam. I mean, I could probably name them.
That's true.
Name them, but it was really more about the singers. And as much as I may bitch and moan about like Winger and some of these bands, they could play well. Yeah. I'm not taking that away from them. I wasn't crazy about the songs that they may have written, like the overall song, but they could play very, very well. These guys could sing very, very well. It's just that it was kind of packaged in something that I couldn't get with. And then in the 90s, the songs might have been great, but there was something missing in the guitar playing and something in the bass playing that just wasn't as, I don't know, just something wasn't there.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it ever came back because, as I mentioned in, I think, one of those videos, I really don't know what came next after the whole grunge thing. I felt like rock as a mainstream thing kind of fell off the map, because I've had people say to me, well, what about like nu metal? And I'm like, well, because they say, well, that's like a genre that came out after the whole grunge thing. And it's like, yeah, but nu metal was not a mainstream force like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and everything. It's like we never got another rock mainstream force after that. It seemed like that all collapsed. And now I don't really know what you call it. We're all over the place, but rock is almost like a back burner kind of thing. And, you know,
that's true. I've never really thought about that. You were going to say something about the Foo Fighters, because they're probably maybe the only one that is a mainstream kind of huge band.
They're like one of the only major rock bands I can think of that's come along since all of that. That, you know, the huge band
you got to listen to
appeals to a lot of people, I should say, not just a huge band, but a band that appeals across the genres.
Right. I don't know if you've ever heard of I keep promoting this band. I don't know if you've ever heard of the band Brand New.
No, I don't think so.
Oh my goodness. They're my favorite band since Nirvana. I mean, since Nirvana, they've really caught my attention. I'll send you some links to some of their best. They're incredible.
They're still around?
2017 was their last one. It was called Science Fiction, and it was incredible. Like their first album was it was more maybe like a heavier version, more punky, heavier version of Green Day. But everything after that has been very different and kind of in the same vein. But they have an album called The Devil and God Are Raging Inside Me, and Daisy and Science Fiction they're some of the best stuff that I've ever listened to as far as musicianship and as far as lyrical content is concerned. Definitely.
How did I miss that? I'll have to check it out.
I don't know how I missed it. I mean, I listened to it like they came out in like 2003 or something like that, and I started listening to them like 2008 or 2009 or something like that. It was
was quite a while afterwards. It was on somebody's website and it just started playing. I'm like, who's that? What's that band? What's that band? And I started typing in the lyrics that I was hearing and finally came up with it, with who they were. But speaking of the Beatles and speaking of Nirvana and Stone Temple Pilots, they had a more pop sensibility. And I think a lot of their pop sensibility, at least with Nirvana, came from the Beatles. He was a huge John Lennon fan. And that can get us into we had a long introduction on this, but hey, it's been a good conversation. So
if somebody's watching this, they're probably saying, when the hell are they going to start talking about the Beatles? But it's the first time that I'm ever meeting you. So come on, guys, give us some slack.
Right. So the Beatles. It seems to be. I went into the bookstore the other day, and it's Beatlemania in there once again. And it's a 20th anniversary of something or other. Or not 20th anniversary. What am I thinking? Help me out here, Anthony.
Well,
what's going on with all this?
Are you
research?
talking about the Get Back thing? Are you talking about the Get Back documentary, which is 50 years, I guess now?
Yes. Yeah. So somebody who likes the Beatles and who respects the Beatles, but I'm not somebody who knows the Beatles. I didn't grow up on it, and it's kind of weird that I didn't see it as a major influence on the music I was listening to as a kid. What do you think about the influence of the Beatles? How would you package that if you were going to start that?
I think that they're the most influential band that's ever been. And I say that because of what I've heard from people who lived at that time. Like my father would tell me that before the Beatles came along, the songs that were out sounded different. When they came, it was kind of like in The Wizard of Oz when it went from black and white to Technicolor. Like something changed, like the melodies, the harmonies. All four guys were singers, and the way that they constructed the melodies and the harmonies, and then everything they did, it seemed they kind of broke ground with how they approached making albums. And I guess a lot of that came to do with the fact that they stopped touring. And so they had a lot of time to sit around and noodle. So you got these weird albums, and they did a lot of different things. And I know that when they went on Ed Sullivan, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say that if it wasn't for that, they probably wouldn't be doing what they're doing. Like that made them want to, for whatever reason. They maybe wanted chicks, or they just wanted to play. Something about that touched them. Mm-hmm. And it's probably got to be the most influential thing that I've ever heard people reference. And I think that, and you know what, I even did one day, many, many years ago, I tried to immerse myself in pre-Beatles stuff. Like I listened to a lot of stuff from 1962, 3, 4, and then I put on the Beatles and started listening. And I could hear that there was a definite difference in what they were bringing in. Like nobody else was kind of really doing that. And they kind of just kept expounding on that. It seemed like every album they came out with was like another, like, wow, I never heard this before. They're doing something different, and I think a lot of people were picking up on that. I never played an instrument, so I can only relate to what other people say. And from what they tell me, that it made them want to write songs. It made them want to express themselves in that kind of way. And so I don't think that you can deny that after all these years, I mean, look, 50 years later, we're digging through archival footage and we're putting out a nearly 8-hour documentary that people are eating up, so that tells you something. People are still crazy for, anything Beatles.
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, there is certainly before Beatles and after Beatles, and especially in, there was rock before Beatles. You had, Chuck Berry, and you had, of course, Elvis. But the Beatles bring something new to the game, that's for sure. And it is interesting to see their evolution as well, from where they first started all the way to, Let It Be, and, going through Sgt. Pepper and the White Album. Just riff on that for a minute. Like take us through their evolution. Like, what do you think, the main theme of, say, their first album was?
Oh, what was their first album? And really, I mean, because they released stuff in Britain and then they released stuff here, you know.
Yeah, the
And
earliest one, I don't know, is like I Want to Hold Your Hand or something like that. I
yeah,
don't know
one
what
of
their
those.
first the early black and white phase. Because there was really, in my opinion, there's really like two Beatles. There was and I'm not an expert by any, probably somebody's out there, wanting to choke me through the screen. But in my opinion, there really was kind of, as I listen back to it and the limited knowledge that I have of it, there really seems to be two Beatles. There seems to be the black and white, the shaggy hair Beatles, and then the psychedelic Beatles. To me,
Yeah.
anyway, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, well, it was like what I said before. They went through a phase where they, of course, were playing to crowds that were screaming so loud they couldn't even hear themselves play. And so that's why they had to stop, is just because it just got crazy. And that afforded them to go into the studio where they started to really, of course, they're with George Martin, and things got really, really clinical. They spent a lot of time working on looping things, taking sounds and reshaping them and messing with their voices and, taking instruments and making them sound different, running songs, right, like back to back, a lot of different things. Like when we get to Abbey Road with like the Abbey Road, the Abbey Road medley,
Mm-hmm.
John Lennon doesn't like that. He hates the medley,
Oh,
which
really?
become an iconic song. It's like it's an iconic thing. He at that particular time, he couldn't stand the fact that they took all these half-written songs and just stitched them and just put it out. Like he didn't like that, because the Beatles really hadn't done much of that. They had written songs and they wrote one song and they did another song and they were different, but they kind of got to a point where with the Abbey Road that, Paul had this idea of just kind of taking this bit and that bit and let's just put them back to back and see what happens with it. And that's what we hear now. And it sounds to us, it sounds great, and it sounds like it flows naturally, but John wasn't really crazy about that idea. And maybe that might've been part of the reason why he was dissatisfied with the whole thing. Of course, there's many, many reasons why the band broke up, but I mean, that may have been one of the things that he just wasn't satisfied with, was just, making that album and having things kind of work and just, rather go on his own kind of thing, But the Beatles really had the fact that they could spend so much time working in the studio. It revealed so much about them, and they really inspired so many people with their approach. When they were able to sit in there and just play around. I mean, those albums, we still go back and listen to them now.
Yeah.
And we'll even hear something will come out now and we'll say, yeah, that sounds like Sgt. Pepper inspired. We're still referencing stuff that the Beatles were laying the groundwork for back in the 60s, And certainly in this documentary now, which one of the most interesting, fascinating things about it is that you could see them working on a lot of these songs. You got to see how they actually worked, how they actually wrote. They're sitting there and they're bouncing stuff off of, each other. And, you actually see songs coming up out of thin air, like Get
Right.
Back, you see Paul McCartney just standing there, just kind of riffing and not really knowing where it's going. And then he starts to mumble and it starts to sound like the song that we know. And it starts to shape up, and the band and I think it was Ringo and George were kind of in there with him. And it's just fascinating. That's one of the things about this documentary is you get to see stuff happening out of thin air that we know became really, really classic stuff.
How did you experience the Beatles? Because you're, a Gen Xer. I mean, I don't know what year you were born or whatever, but, hearing you talk and saying I was, a teenager in this decade, and, so you're close to my age, you're in the same generation bracket, at least. When you were a teenager listening to music, discovering kind of your own music for the first time, rather than just, whatever's on in the car while you're driving and mom and dad are playing it. And you started developing your own unique musical taste. Where did the Beatles fit in for you with that? Did they fit in at that time of your life, or was that something later that you discovered?
Well, I was born in '69.
Okay.
So by the time I started to become interested in music, I mean, my father was really into music, and he had all of the Beatles albums. So there came a point where I basically confiscated all of his Beatles albums. They became part of my own collection. And I was listening to all of the albums. The album covers were interesting. And so I would listen to them, and I really couldn't appreciate it like I can now. But at the time, I was drawn into all of them. I just loved all of the albums. And I remember when John Lennon died, that was the first death that I remember that really hit me, because I was listening to all of that stuff at that time. I must have been around 11 years old, because that was around 1980, in December of 1980. I think the anniversary 81. For that just passed. Was it? No, I think it was 80 when.
Was it? I could have swore it was 80. Oh, yeah, I thought it was 81, but I could totally be wrong. Maybe 81 is when they tried to assassinate Reagan or something. For some reason
that might have been that. Yeah.
1980. Yeah. I remember seeing an interview with John Lennon, and him saying, the 70s are behind us and let's get on with the 80s. And unfortunately, it was not too long in the 80s for him before he was assassinated. And I do know that a lot of people were saddened by that. For me, I remember where I was when I heard that Kurt Cobain died. And that was, my John Lennon dying experience, or my JFK dying experience. I'm like, oh my gosh, this legend is no longer with us, and when you have something like that, like with John Lennon dying, and you have such a massive band, I think one of the things that happens is people still hold out hope for a reunion. You know what I mean? Like a band, especially like that had broken up. You think, gosh, maybe, like the Eagles, I mean, they hated each other, but somehow they pulled it together later and let bygones be bygones, and went, on tour again. Still, while all of them were alive before Glenn Frey died. I think for people who really, really liked the Beatles back then, it was just like, oh my gosh, we're never going to hear that again. We're never going to hear that again. And that's settles super heavy on people. And especially, like I said, a band like the Beatles that were so influential and, meant so much to so many people, even though they broke up, there's always that hope inside your back of your head. Oh, they'll get together again. 20 years, they'll get together again. And now it's just like, no, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. And I think that there was a good chance that they probably would have done something again in the 80s. I think Paul McCartney's solo career started to kind of lose some gas towards the middle part of the 80s. Mm-hmm. Ringo's career never really had any gas. George Harrison, he actually started to pick up steam towards the later half of the 70s. Once he got with Jeff Lynne and did the Traveling Wilburys and then his Cloud Nine, that really put him back on the map again. And Lennon, it's not, he started off kind of strong, like before he died. Everybody was loving to have. I'm just trying to say that there could have been the right ingredients for something with the Beatles in the 80s, or maybe even into the 90s, because they really, at that point, they had made peace. Paul and John in particular had made peace. And so what would have stopped them from getting together to do something, didn't have to be a permanent thing, but they could have definitely gotten back. I don't see why they couldn't have done that.
Yeah, it'd be a reunion that would have been awesome. I do have to say that the first set of albums that I got when I first got my first record player when I was like 9 or 10 years old, and it was Christmas, and I got Annie, and I got Kenny Rogers, The Gambler, and I got Paul McCartney, Pipes of Peace.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and that one had the because I think
that's the one that I was talking about when he was losing gas. I think the Pipes of Peace were kind of like when he starts to, because I don't know what did that album had. What was on that album? That was the hit. Say, yeah.
Yeah.
Which was, I think, one of his last big songs.
Big hits, right,
Yeah.
right. So if somebody's out there and they're listening to this and they're like, oh, they should talk about this with the Beatles. I mean, I'm waiting for you to talk about this. What do you think some of the highlights of their career or the new documentary that you'd like to riff on or talk about?
Well, the documentary, I mean, there's so much to talk about with the documentary. I mean, I know that you're into movies a lot, right? So you're probably familiar with Peter Jackson and the stuff that he's done with Lord of the Rings and all of that. He did this documentary, and so he brings a lot of the technology that he had for his big time Hollywood stuff. He kind of brought it into this, which I think really gives a whole nother dimension to this entire thing. And I'll give you just one example. Fortunately, the guy that originally was the producer, he had cameras and microphones everywhere. He wanted to capture audio no matter where these guys were. And he put a microphone in a flower pot in the cafeteria. So should any of them go and want to go talk privately, then he would be picking up on the audio, right? That was in a flower pot. Unfortunately, that audio, for one reason or another, it didn't sound good, so it was never used. And so let's say the original film that came out never went to that audio because the audio was you probably couldn't make anything of it. Well, now Peter Jackson has employed this artificial intelligence to be able to discern, like if the band is sitting there and they're playing, like if you've got someone playing the drums and there's someone talking, he has it so that the machine can learn what a drum sounds like and what Paul sounds like, so he can separate them. So now, while someone's playing the drums, or maybe sitting there and playing on the guitar, you can tone that down and bring the audio up of whoever's talking. So now we can hear people clearer. With the flower pot, there was a time when George Harrison quits. He gets up and leaves, and Paul and John go to the cafeteria and they talk about it. And the original film never had this in there, but now that Peter Jackson has this AI, he can hear what they're saying. And so, and it's an amazing thing to hear after George leaves. Paul and John are going back and forth about what's going on. And it's really fascinating because, John lays into Paul and tells him, you're a bit much, you want us to do what you want to do. And Paul is telling him, well, you used to be the leader and I'm kind of stepping up now. And so there's a lot of back and forth as to why George left and what are we going to do, how are we going to get him back? But in the process, you kind of hear them ripping each other up about why George left, you're too much of a boss and all this stuff. And so we're kind of clued into these conversations that we never heard before. And while they're, while they're performing, not performing, but while they're practicing and trying to come up with songs, they're sitting there strumming and they're talking to one another. And, he's got the ability to, like I said, tone down the drums so we can hear what they're actually saying. We can hear their
conversation.
So it opens up a whole new world of what we're able to actually hear. And it's very, very fascinating in that regard. One of the other things that I love about this film is we get to see the rooftop concert from start to finish. And the AI comes in handy with this too, because as you may have heard, when the Beatles go up on the roof, they're making a whole lot of noise and the cops come. And so in the original film, which by the way, I have a copy of, I was talking about the whole bootleg stuff. Among all my trades, I didn't even know that I had it. I saw the original film. Actually, it's a German print that somebody had tried to fix up. And even still, it looks very, very grainy. But the original film, it doesn't show the whole show, and they show the cops coming in, but you don't hear what they're saying. And before you know it, the cops kind of come in, and before you know it, they're up on the roof. Whereas in this film, you get to see what actually happens. You know, the cops come in, and because there's microphones planted, Jackson uses the AI. We can hear the cops talking to the people that are in the lobby. And so you can hear them trying to put the cops off, you know, oh yeah, we're going to get so-and-so is going to come and see, you know, and the cops are sitting there waiting. The cops don't even know the Beatles are on the roof. You know, they don't know where they are. They think that they're in a studio making a lot of noise, you know. And so you get to hear what the cops are saying, and the tension builds as the show goes on, because you know the cops are down, they're talking to the people in the lobby, and eventually the cops find out that they're on the roof, and then they get taken up to the roof, and plus they use a split screen so that you see the cops and you see the fans on the street, you see the bands playing. And I thought that their use of, you know, having all of this time to be able to present this, they had the luxury of hours of being able to just show you everything that was going on. And so, you know, the other thing about it too with Peter Jackson is that the whole restoration of the video, is just amazing. And I think it goes beyond anything we've ever seen. I think they're employing a lot of different, I've heard people call it like deep fake kind of tactics, you know, where they're able to
but deep fake to kind of get to what it would have really been
to
like.
Get to something real.
Right so they're, you know,
using
fake tactics, but to get to something that was genuine,
to make something better, you know, like there's old 16 like millimeter footage that they've been able to make it look like it was just happening yesterday. I mean, that's one of the things. I'm sitting here watching this movie and I'm just thinking to myself, wow, this looks like they just shot it, you know, and it was so real that
it's amazing.
I felt like I was watching like a reality show.
Wow.
You know? And it was just stunning to sit there and see. And it was so immersive. You feel like you're right there with them. When it was over, I had like a withdrawal. I was just like, well, what comes next? You know, let's see the next one, you know. And it just goes to show you what they can do now.
Yeah. Do you think having a band like the Beatles, where you have 4 singers, do you think that's disastrous? Do you think that's kind of a disaster waiting to happen? You know, I mean, it just, to me, it seems like, well, I mean, can you have 4 stars? You know, well, 4 stars trying to do the same thing. I mean, you can have the guitar god and the singer and the cool basser and the cool drum, but this isn't just that. This is 4 people competing for the voice of a band, which has 4 voices. I just see that as somewhat of a disaster waiting to happen, which it did. But
I think it was more of a matter of 3 songwriters. Ringo was happy to be in the band, and they threw him songs. He didn't really write much of anything. And he wasn't the star, even though his last name is Starr. He wasn't a star. And never was going to be. He was there, and he would have loved if the band had never broken up. He would have gladly stayed. John and Paul were the main songwriters when the band first got going. George wasn't much of a songwriter, but eventually he started to get better and better. And so that's where things started to get crazy, was that George started to become better and better, more of an equal strength. And I think there's even talk about it here in this documentary about how he was only going to get 1 or 2 songs an album.
Yeah, 2 tracks an album.
That's it.
That was, and they were going to get.
Yeah. I mean, this was like years into their career, and this is all that he was going to get. I mean, look at what he did when he left. Like after his first solo album outside of the Beatles was a triple album set, you know, and it's regarded as the best one of them all. I mean, it's a very, very solid set. And he had all of these songs that he was sitting on. By the time we get to this particular documentary, there's even a conversation that he has with John Lennon, and he's like, I've got all of these songs, and I'm thinking about maybe doing an album of all of my own songs. And he's talking to John about this, and John is like, and so and they actually talk about, yeah, maybe I can do an album and we can still do the Beatles, and they're openly talking about having the Beatles and also having a solo career. Which was kind of interesting.
They should have done what Kiss did, where they had like one album with all, they didn't do that in every album, but one album was all Paul, and one album was all Ace Frehley, and one album was all Gene, and down the line. I wonder if that would have worked out, but oh well, we'll never know at that point.
Well, what was interesting is that Peter Jackson said that he talked to Paul about that, because Paul wasn't there when George and John were talking about this, about having a solo career and being in the Beatles.
Okay.
Paul was not there. And Peter Jackson talked to Paul about it and said, what if you had been there and heard that kind of talk? And Paul thinks that things might have been different if he had actually been there, because Paul was ready to get out after a certain point, and if there had been more dialogue about maybe keeping things going, it's possible that things might have been different. Although, I don't know. I think in retrospect, the band was going to be done anyway for a lot of other reasons. But getting back to what you were talking about, I think that the fact that we had 3 songwriters that were, major, that was a problem, because George was never going to be equal to the best friends of John and Paul, that they were a team.
Yeah.
And George was never gonna be equal and get as much airtime, let's say. But even the John and Paul thing started to fade because, John hooked up with Yoko, and of course, Paul's got his wife and everything. So they didn't spend as much time with one another. And as Paul said later, it's kind of like army buddies. You kind of know that this is going to end. You're in the you're in the trenches, and you're in the you're in the battle, but eventually that you're going to have to go home and kind of grow up and go do something else. And that's
right.
the way his attitude was. And there was even talk in the documentary, I think Paul or somebody referenced to, the band was going through like a divorce, they kind of felt like there was a divorce period,
Mm-hmm.
So
well, I know that they were going to split on a few other occasions, and it was Paul that really held them together. And then finally, Paul said, "Hey, I'm done." And when Paul said, "Hey, he's done," everybody just went, "All right, that's great. We'll get out of here."
Well, actually, John's the one that quit.
Oh, is it
in a private meeting?
Oh, really? Because I always thought it was Paul. I thought it was finally Paul who said, "Hey, I'm done. I'm finally done." I remember hearing that. But maybe this new documentary sheds light on it.
Well, the thing with Paul was that when he put his first solo album out in 1970, would have been the year after this documentary. See, people talk about this documentary and say, "Oh, it was happy times. It was good times." Well, just over the next year, it was a whole different story. We start getting into late 69 and early 1970. It was not very, very, not very, very happy for these guys. Paul puts out his solo album, and in it is an interview, like this interview that you could read Paul with, I don't know who it is that he's talking to, but the guy asks him if he has any plans to do another Beatles album or to do anything with the Beatles, and he says no. And so that was seen as the first public statement of the Beatles breaking up. And John Lennon got pissed off at Paul because when John quit, it was a private band thing, and they were supposed to not tell anybody. They didn't want to tell the press or anything. He felt like Paul one-upped him. And
he got to the press first, basically.
He got to the press first. Like, he's the one that told everybody about it, when really John was the one. John's attitude was like, I started this band and I'm going to end it. That's kind of what his attitude was. But there were a lot of things that went into breaking up the Beatles. One of them was, like I just said, the songwriting.
Well, Yoko Ono is always credited as I don't know if that's overstated or overblown, but I know from what I've heard, people were not exactly happy that she was making musical contributions to the Beatles.
Well, there is a lot of talk about Yoko now, and people are saying, you see, she didn't break up the Beatles, because in this film, you see her basically just sitting there next to John. She's just sitting there, and she's like knitting and she's drawing, and she doesn't seem like she cares in the least what's going on, and I think that she's there because John wanted her there. Now, something that wasn't talked about, but that really happened, was Yoko, she lost a child in November of 68. Okay. And so she had shacked up with John. John's wife actually walked in on them, and that's what ended the marriage. But she got pregnant. She was supposed to have a baby in February of 1969, which would have been a month after this documentary. So if she had stayed pregnant,
wait, say that again. Who walked in on? Say that. Okay. Run that by me again. That went by a little quickly. Okay. So, all right.
Lennon, he was married to Cynthia.
Okay.
I think they got married in the early 60s, and they had Julian. Okay. It was 1968. Lennon has a weekend or a time with Yoko at his house, and John Lennon's wife walks in on him. And so that ends the marriage.
Yeah.
But Yoko's but she gets pregnant, right? So she was supposed to have the baby the following year, which would have been the year of this documentary. Because this whole thing happens in January 1969. That's really what the documentary is about, is that 1 month. But in February, she would have had a baby, but she lost it in November. So that's also interesting, is how would that have been different if she had been like 9 months pregnant? Would she have even been there? Like, would she have been wanting to sit there in a drafty,
right?
Would she have wanted to sit there all day long? Maybe not, and how would that have changed things if John Lennon became a father again? Would that have changed the whole thing? It's really hard to say. But the thing about Yoko, though, is that I see her as a destructive force when it comes to John. They did a lot of drugs. They went from doing, they did their share of pot and maybe some coke and everything. But when she came along, John started getting into like H, and things got very, very dark. Even Paul McCartney was even like, this is an area, doing the heroin and everything is a whole nother ball game. And so he didn't like the fact that John was going off the deep end. I mean, just have to look at the album that John and Yoko did. I forget the name of it. Two Virgins, I think it was called. They're standing there on the album cover. They're both completely naked with all their junk out. Like, why do we need to see this? This is John. This is like, it's just like, why are they doing this? I think that when Lennon met her, I think he lost his mind, to be honest with you, because he started, like I said, he's standing on an album cover completely naked. He's taking heroin. The fact that he was no longer spending a lot of time with Paul, he's hanging out with her a lot. So him and Paul lost the closeness. Things started to change. There was a dynamic there that started to change. And I think that people say, well, Yoko was just, because they see this documentary and she's just sitting there not doing anything. And yeah, she wasn't there directing the band, telling them what songs to play or adding anything. But I think that her being in John's life was not a good thing. And I think that that was, I think John, I think, well, you could say that he broke up the Beatles because in that particular band meeting, he decided to leave, but that wasn't the only thing. I think the fact that he was heavily into drugs, and the fact that he was no longer writing with Paul, that, they were kind of growing separately, and
they were writing separately and then just kind of coming together, and
they were writing separately. They were really growing apart. And I would imagine Paul, imagine you're Paul, this is your best friend, John, and you see what's happening. His marriage is broken up. Now his son, Julian, doesn't have a father the way, and even Paul wrote a song about it.
Yeah. Hey, Jude. Yeah.
Hey, Jude. He wrote that for Julian because he felt bad about what was going on, which is kind of bold. And he's writing a song about his best friend's son because he hates to see what happened to the marriage and everything. And so Paul is seeing his best friend go through the hard drugs and now he's with someone else, and his wife and son are behind, and it's impacting the Beatles, and he's not able to write with him anymore. So a lot of dynamics going on there.
Yeah.
A lot going on, and I think that all kind of crescendoed. We start.
Well, they got to see what their lives would be like too on their own. You know what I mean? They got to have their own kind of career and see, okay, I don't have, these other guys here with me, and let's see what I can do on my own. And I think I think there's good things about that and bad things about that. I think that they, did things that they would not have done if they had stuck together. And in ways they were stronger, but also they're not the same either. They don't have each other to strengthen each other in their songwriting and stuff like that, that they would have had together. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I think probably the person that it turned out best for was Harrison. I mean, in my opinion, because he finally got to be the breakout star that, he was, I think, anyway. I think he's the undersell in the band personally. I thought, I think he's a great guitarist, and I thought that he was a great songwriter, and he didn't get to shine the way that he would have shined if they would have stuck together and he would have just been a Beatle. Then he gets to be George Harrison. Now, that doesn't mean I don't love the other Beatle members. Probably my favorite Beatle is John. I mean, I just kind of identify with him a little bit more. But I just think that it was, for George Harrison, he got to be George Harrison. And I think it just kind of looking back on it, I think George Harrison's creativity is absorbed in a degree into the band more, and he becomes part of the milieu more than John and Paul. John and Paul still remain John and Paul, just John and Paul in the Beatles. I don't know. That's just kind of my take on it, I think. So, excuse me.
Yeah,
Sorry,
George
guys.
definitely was sitting on a lot of stuff. He had a lot to say.
Yeah.
And it was very apparent in this documentary that he was frustrated, which is one of the reasons he left, which you see in this documentary, which you did not see in the original film, was George leaving, that's something else that's nice about this film that the other film didn't have the luxury of. At the time, the guy that made the film, he asked Paul, he said, I would like to include the footage of George getting up and walking out. And Paul didn't want to put it in because he was like, well, George came back, so let's not go over that. Let's not,
let's not damage that. Let's not.
Like, he came back, it's over. Why are you going to put that in for? But now, 50 years later, that's a historical moment. We want to see George getting up and walking out. And it's a very dramatic moment. We have the luxury of being able to put that in now, and you see why. Paul is trying to show George how to play a guitar part right. And George is getting frustrated. And George is telling him, look, I'll play it however you want to, or I could not play anything at all. He's kind of like very gentlemanly kind of telling him, what the hell you want me to do? And he's kind of, and so he, eventually just gets up and leaves.
Right.
And so that was one of the nice things about this is, and not just that, but the aftermath of it. The next day, George doesn't show up. They don't know if he's going to show up. And you see probably one of the most dramatic moments of the entire thing is you see Paul sitting there and he's thinking, and the camera is focused on him, and you can see the tears welling up in his eyes, thinking about, maybe I screwed this up, maybe, because John wasn't even there. He hadn't shown up yet. And Paul is thinking, he even says, and then there were two, because it was him and Ringo were the only people who had shown up the next day. So he wondered if he really botched this whole thing up and if George was ever going to come back. And you don't see that in the original film. This is stuff that you don't see. So this new film adds a whole nother dimension to what was going on. It really sheds a light on a lot of things. I mean, you get to see them having a real happy time, which you didn't see. Well, you saw pieces of it in the original one, but in this one, over the course of 7 hours or whatever it is, you really get to see them goofing off and having a lot of fun. And I kind of liken that to, like, people, maybe you've been in like a relationship where things like the wheels are going to fall off and it's not going to last forever, but you can still find a way to laugh. You can still find a way to be happy about it. The sun does break through on a partly cloudy day, right? And I think that's what this film kind of shows you, is that even though there's the stuff going on, like what I was talking about, the drugs, because John was using during this time, and the tension going on with John and Paul and George, and then plus the tension of being in this place where they're being filmed and eavesdropped on, and there's a lot going on. They still laugh and have a good time, and that was good to see, because I think a lot of people thought that this was just one big knockdown, drag out fight where everybody was miserable, but it really wasn't quite like that during that particular month, at least. Maybe later.
Yeah. What's also interesting to me is I'd like to look at the philosophy of music and how it how the music reflects the philosophy, and it very much captures the course of the Beatles. Really, very much captures the philosophy of that era, and basically the disintegration of the hippie movement. And like we talked about the death of hair metal, and in one person had said, and I don't really remember who it was, said like, in the end, hair metal kind of killed itself.
Yeah.
And
there wasn't any one thing. Like people want to say, oh, it was like, like when Nirvana came on, it killed it. Or like when Ono came on the scene with John and Yoko, she killed it. It's not as simple as that.
Well, it starts out very optimistic, and the hippie movement did start out very optimistic. It was, they took drugs, but drugs was an ideology. It was like, we are going to make the world a better place through drugs. And they realized very quickly, and, they had the whole Rolling Stone thing, the whole turn on, tune out, tune in, whatever, the Timothy Leary thing, and then Rolling Stones saying something about, we'll put drugs in the water. I mean, they believed it wasn't just drugs as an escapism, it was drugs as an ideology. And it was very kind of this optimistic movement at the very beginning. And then they realized real quickly, hey, there's no optimism here. You start peeling the onion and you realize it's just another layer upon another layer upon another layer, and there's nothing in the middle, and then it disintegrates. And I think you see that pretty clearly in the musical career of the Beatles. You have this optimism, this I want to hold your hand, this a lot of love songs, a lot of upbeat kind of songs. And then within a matter of 3 years, you're getting to, we need to turn into psychedelics. And then after that, you got Let It Be. And that's just like, we don't know what life's about. This is how it is. And then they break up. And I kind of see it interesting that the philosophy that led to the end of what we would consider to be the hippie movement, and even later than the hippie movement into the disco and punk era, really is reflected in the career of these. It becomes very existential. Very existential. John's lyrics, I don't believe in anything, just Yoko. I don't even believe in the Beatles, just Yoko and me. That lyric from that song is it's super existential. And, that's kind of where that stuff that leads you, that optimism without a real secure foundation it drives itself up. I see that reflected in, it's almost like a diet made of pure sugar. It's not going to taste good at first, but it's just not going to sustain you. You know what I mean?
Right.
So yeah. Any final thoughts here as far as the Beatles and are concerned, and the documentary are concerned? And we'll wrap it up here in just a minute. I'll give you a chance to tell everybody where they can find you online. But any final thoughts? Anything else you wanted to add as far as the documentary or the Beatles in general are concerned?
I would just try to recommend people check it out if they're curious about this particular thing. I know that people are concerned about it being a very long commitment, but I would say to these people, you know what? I mean, how much bullshit do you watch on Netflix that takes season after season? You know what I mean? Hours and hours. You can't watch a 7-hour documentary. I mean,
right.
And it's in 3 parts, it's broken up. People are binge watching all kinds of stuff. I think that people are kind of thrown off by because it just seems when you're watching it, I did feel like, wow, this is really going to be a lot, because you're sitting there day after day. Peter Jackson does a very good job. He's got the whole calendar. He kind of takes you through every single day of January, kind of like marks it off as they go from day to day. And as you're going through it, you're really sitting there going, wow, this is really going to be a long thing, sitting here in the trenches with them, knocking out these songs and all this stuff. But I think it's worth it. It's a piece of history that I'm glad that Peter Jackson was able to really excavate. And I think one of the other reasons why it's good that it's 8 hours is because if it wasn't, then a lot of this stuff would just go back into a vault and you'd never see it. I mean, when who else is going to take the time to do all of this with the machine learning and all this stuff that he did with the restoration? It's like now was the time to seize on it and to go through this and to make the best of it. And I wouldn't be shocked, because he talked about there being an 18-hour edit. That's what he had kind of come down to, was like 18 hours. And then he wanted to get it down further, but he couldn't get it down to less than 6 because he really didn't want to cut anything out of what he had there. But there might be another 10 more hours. Maybe it'll be on a Blu-ray.
Yeah, maybe it'll be on an extended edition or something like that.
We'll see. But I would encourage people to check it out because it is a piece of history. And it's just, I find it fascinating because I was watching it and I'm the kind of guy, I watch this and I want to learn about this piece, and I'll go watch this and I'll learn a whole bunch about, this particular character that was in there, because there's all kinds of people in this. People show up at various points and it's just, I just find it fascinating. So I would definitely recommend it.
Cool. Anthony, it has been an absolute pleasure. You're a bright guy and you certainly know a lot about music. Tell everyone where they can find you online and the best way to support you.
Well, the best way to find me online would be to go to my YouTube channel. I do have a website, rushtrader.com, although I'm not sure. I think there might be. Yes, there is a link on my homepage there to get to my YouTube channel, but I would just go to the YouTube channel for Rushtrader. That's where you'll find me there. And the best way to support is to watch the videos and to interact.
And subscribe.
And to sub. Yeah, any kind of interaction helps the videos get out there, because YouTube, if they see that something is getting watched and something is liked, they want to get it in front of more and more people. So that's the whole thing, is to interact as much as possible. And that's what I encourage. So, and thank you for having me on, and I really did enjoy it.
Yeah. It's been a great conversation. Stick with me just a minute. I'll talk with you a little bit after the show. Well, everyone, you've been watching Retro Serial or listening to Retro Serial. Please do me the honor of hitting that like button, hitting the subscribe button, and hitting the bell notification if you want to know when these things are available. Share this on your favorite social media. And if you're listening to this on podcast form, please go ahead and write me a review and leave a rating. That would mean the world to me. And share it so you can let everybody know about the great content you're receiving right here at Retro Serial. And if you like what we're doing on our podcast, head on over to our YouTube page, because if you like what we're doing here, you're going to love what we're doing over there. But wherever you're listening, wherever you're watching, I'm just glad you're watching, and I really, really appreciate it. If you want to support the channel financially, you want to help me grow this YouTube and podcast mogul empire, you are welcome to visit the Patreon page. Follow the link below where you'll find 2 levels of support. There is the Cornflake Club, which is a no frills, no sugar type of cereal, and it's $3 a month, and it's just a thank you. And then there is the Honeycomb Hideout, and in the Honeycomb Hideout, which is only $5 a month to support this favorite podcast of yours and YouTube channel, and you get most all videos and most all podcasts one day in advance. So you want to be on the Insiders Club, be part of that Honeycomb Hideout, head on over there and show your support. As always, thank you, everybody, and stay retro, everyone.